Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. It's good to see everybody here this morning. This morning we're going to introduce a new topic, and it's called letting go. It is absolutely necessary to let go of our past if we are to have a promising future. You cannot embrace the future if our hands are tied to the past. Letting go. To consider some thoughts concerning this topic, letting go. Since the beginning of time, people have suffered unfairly. There's nothing new under the sun. In the beginning of time, people suffered unfairly, and because sin entered into the world and God cursed the earth, and of course, Adam handed over the authority to the devil when he sinned against God. And thank God that Jesus came into the world. He lived a sinless life. He died on the cross. He resurrected from the grave. And he took back the authority that the devil stole. And now all authority is given to Jesus in heaven and earth. But we are still stuck in a world that's cursed. And there's sorrow and there's suffering. And God gives everybody free choice to decide to do good or to decide to do bad. And unfortunately, when people decide to do bad, other people are affected. And so we are going to suffer unfairly at times. And that's part of this world that we're living in. And we need to learn to let go. Let's turn our Bibles, if you would, to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 4, and we're going to read verse 1 through 8. Genesis chapter 4, we're going to read verse 1 through 8. In this particular set of passages, we have Adam and Eve, and they had two sons. And their sons were called Cain and Abel. And do we find suffering in the heart of the parents that not only lost one son, but obviously, if you would, in Genesis chapter 4, beginning with verse 1. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why are you angry, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou do well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lies at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and killed him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And God said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood cries unto me from the ground. So imagine Adam and Eve finding out. I don't know how to envision this, but maybe Cain and Abel had a habit of coming back home at a certain time for dinner. And then when that time arrived and the table was empty and they didn't have the presence of the son, can you imagine the worry of a parent, how they might feel? This is a little different. This is a little odd. Genesis, all the way to Revelation. Suffering has been going on since day one. Suffering is not something new to humanity just because we're experiencing it. And what the whole point that I'm trying to make as we talk about people suffering is a lot of us are not going to have a good chance in embracing the future when our hands are still tied to the past. We're not going to be able to embrace the possibilities that the future can bring for those that are in Christ Jesus. We're not going to be able to have joy and fulfillment and build meaningful relationship as long as we are still holding on to the past trauma, as long as we're still holding on to the past betrayal that we experienced, as long as we are still holding on to the past disappointments and the past brokenness of life. Adam and Eve suffered when their son was murdered by their other son. Suffering is nothing new under the sun. Now notice, if you would, in Genesis chapter 34, we're going to look at another example of suffering in this family. Go to Genesis chapter 34, if you would. We're going to read verse 1 through 7. Genesis chapter 34, verse 1 through 7. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this name right, Dinah. She was a woman that was raped. So can you imagine you find out that one of your family members, one of your sisters, one of your nieces, one of your family members was raped? Can you imagine the anger and the anguish of hearing such news? Now notice in Genesis chapter 34, verse 1 through 7. If you have another translation like the Amplified, it will elaborate that she was sexualized by force, which is rape. Notice if you would in verse 1. And Dinah, the daughter of Leah, when she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and defiled her. And his soul clave unto Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. And he loved the Dasmol, the young lady, and spake kindly unto the young lady. And Shechem spake unto his father Hamor, saying, Get me this young lady for a wife. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now, what if that was you? What if you were Jacob? What if you were Jacob and you heard that somebody raped your daughter? How would you feel about that? And we can read all the way to verse 7. Verse 5 again. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field, and Jacob held his peace until they were come. And Hamor the father of Shechem went out unto Jacob to commune with him. And the sons of Jacob came out of the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved, and the men were very angry, because he had wrought folly in Israel in line with Jacob's daughter, which thing ought not to be done. Once again, here's Dinah being a victim of rape. There's a lot of family members that have been a victim of rape, a victim of child molestation. The devastation that brings to a family. What I'm trying to stress is every one of us has a story of our past. I don't know. Maybe some of you have been molested. Maybe some of you have been physically abused. Maybe some of you have been verbally abused. Maybe someone that you trusted, someone that you love, betrayed you and walked out of your life and committed the act of betrayal. Maybe someone has hurt you severely. You know, if we don't get over that, it's going to cripple our future. If we don't get over that, it's going to hinder our relationship with God and building relationships with others in general. If we don't get over that, we'll talk a little bit about the effects that has. But notice another example of somebody suffering unfairly. Let's talk about Joseph. Go to Genesis chapter 37, verse 17 to 36. Genesis chapter 37. We're going to read verse 17 to 36. Genesis chapter, I said 37. Verse 17 through, I put 36, but we'll start with verse 17. We'll start with verse 17. Here's Joseph, and his brothers hated him. Did Joseph do anything wrong to earn the hatred from his brothers? No, we know that Jacob obviously practiced favoritism concerning Joseph over the rest of his sons. But that was Jacob's wrongdoing. That wasn't Joseph's wrongdoing. And did Joseph pay the price for his father's unfair treatment or partiality treatment, if you would, concerning that situation? He was hated by his brothers. Now, can hatred cause us to do some very horrible things? And we're going to find out that even Joseph's own brothers hated him. And when they saw him coming from afar off, they said, look at this dreamer. He's coming. What should be done unto him? And they pretty much got him by force, and they're going to kill him. But then one of the older brothers prevented that from happening. So they put him in a pit. And then we're going to find out that there was some people that were going to be headed to Egypt. And they decided, we're going to make a profit and sell our brother as a slave into Egypt and not kill him. But notice, if you would, in Genesis chapter 37, let's begin in verse 17. And the man said, they departed hence for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. And when Joseph's brethren saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, behold, this dreamer comes. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him and cast him into some pit. And we will say, some evil animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. And Reuben heard it and delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again. And it came to pass, when Joseph was coming to his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat. Who's stripping Joseph out of his coat? His own brothers, his own family. Is that an act of betrayal? Even our own family can betray us. Even our own family can be the instrument that brings suffering and pain in our lives. His own family. Notice in verse 24, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our flesh. And his brethren were content. Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit. And they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they brought Joseph into Egypt. And Reuben returned unto the pit. And behold, Joseph was not in the pit. And he tore his clothes. And he returned unto his brethren and said, the child is not. And I, whither shall I go? And they took Joseph's coat, and killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the coat in the blood. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father, and said, this have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or not. And Jacob knew it, and said, it is my son's coat. An evil animal has devoured him. Joseph was without doubt torn in pieces. And Jacob tore his clothes, and put sackcloth upon his loins, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I will go down into the grave until my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. And the Midianites sold Joseph into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's, and a captain of the guard. Is there anything new under the sun? There's nothing new under the sun. Now later on we're going to see how Joseph handled this betrayal. Later on, we're going to see how Joseph handled this betrayal, but we're not there yet. But I want you to see that he was betrayed by his own brothers. He was sold as a slave into Egypt by his own brothers. And you're going to see, as you study the life of Joseph, he did not hold on to that. Many of us in the church, we don't have the joy because we're still holding on to the past. Many of us have a hard time building meaningful relationships, and we have a hard time maintaining relationships. We push people away because our hearts are so close-hearted. We have walls around our heart because we are very skeptical. We have a hard time trusting. We have a hard time letting people in our hearts, and we're the ones who are going to suffer for that because we're going to go to the grave with shallow relationships, broken relationships, regrets, misery, suffering, and all these other things that we harbor inside of our hearts because we are not willing to let things go from the past. It's going to affect us. It's going to affect your marriage. It's going to affect your parenting. It's going to affect your relationships. It's going to affect your well-being. It's going to affect every part of you if you still hold on to your past. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. And we'll talk a little bit about his reaction to it later on. Then Joseph was sold as a slave into Egypt. And he was working for a man by the name of Potiphar. And he was a faithful man. And then Potiphar's wife began to like Joseph in a romantic way and began to lust after Joseph and began to try to seduce Joseph to sleep with her. And Joseph would not sleep with her. And in the last event when Joseph being tempted by her, Joseph fled. And then Potiphar's wife took his coat, and then she falsely accused Joseph for trying to rape her, and then Joseph was sent into prison. Notice, if you would, in Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. We're going to begin in verse 7. Genesis chapter 39 beginning with verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his mother's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Sleep with me or lie with me. But he refused and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, You see, he has brought in this Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which you have brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant do to me, that his wrath was kindled, and Joseph's master took Joseph and put Joseph into prison, a place where the king prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed Joseph mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was a doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with Joseph, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Now, how fair is that? That Joseph was doing the right thing, and Potiphar's wife was trying to lie with Joseph repeatedly, and then one day the house was empty. No one was there but Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And Potiphar's wife tried to, if you would, force herself upon Joseph. And Joseph, he fled. He got out of that situation. And as he was beginning to flee, she took a hold of his coat and screamed. And then the men came in, and she accused Joseph for trying to rape her. And then when her husband came home, she shared with him the story. And naturally, the husband, believing that it was true, was angry at Joseph, took Joseph, called maybe the police officers, had him arrested, and put him in prison for something he did not do. You're going to see Joseph overcame this. Joseph did not get bitter. Joseph did not hold on to this unfair false accusation. Joseph did not hold on to his past. What about us? Are we holding on to our past? Are we still living in the past? Are we still holding on to the betrayal in our past? Are we still holding on to the remarks that were made to us in our past? Are we still holding on to the things that people did do to us or didn't do to us when we needed them the most? Are we still holding on to the past? Because if you are, you don't have a bright future. Your relationships are going to be affected. You're not going to have the ability to open up your heart and get close to God, or open up your heart and get close to people. You'll have some type of relationship, but it's going to be very shallow. It's going to be very shallow. It's not going to be deep and meaningful. It's going to be a very shallow relationship because we just don't let go of our past. We'll look at two more. Go to the book of Job. Job chapter 1. What we see in this chapter is a man that loved the Lord, a man that was a righteous man, and one that hated evil, shunned from evil, and followed after righteousness in his life. And you're going to see the suffering that Job went through that was not merited. Notice in Job chapter 1, let's go to the beginning, if you would, in verse 13. In Job chapter 1, beginning with verse 13. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain all your servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God has fallen from heaven, and has burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house. And it fell upon the young men, and they are all dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Then Job arose and tore his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God foolishly. He lost all his possessions in one day. Can you imagine waking up in the morning, and let's say for 20 years, 30 years, you've been saving all this money, and kind of find out your account is empty. And on top of that, you get the news that all your children were in the same car and they were driving from state to state, and they got in a car accident by maybe a semi, and all of them are dead. Can we develop bitterness toward God and charge God foolishly as if God was the one driving the truck? Can we do that? We get angry toward God. We get bitter toward God. We begin to shake our fists at God and say, God, why did you allow this to happen? And if we don't overcome that, we're going to go into our future still holding on to anger and bitterness, how cruel life has been to us. We'll look at one more. Jesus was betrayed by his own friend. There's a prophecy in the book of Psalms chapter 41 verse 9 talking about Jesus referring to Judas, that his own friend that ate bread with him lifted up his heel against him. Go to Psalms chapter 41 and verse 9. Psalms chapter 41 and verse 9. In Psalms chapter 41 and verse 9 it says, yea, my own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, had lifted up his heel against me. This is Jesus speaking through David, prophesying about Judas, his own familiar friend, one that he ate bread and shared bread with, has lifted up his heel against me. Turn the Bibles, if you would, to John chapter 18. John chapter 18, verse 1 through 13. John chapter 18, verse 1 to 13. In this account, it reveals the account of Judas betraying Jesus and how the love of money was a driving force behind that betrayal. People betray a lot of people for a lot of things, whether it be for the love of money or other things too. Notice, if you would, in John chapter 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forward with his disciples over the brook of Cedron. Over the brook Cedron, where was a garden, into the which he entered and his disciples. And Judas also, which betrayed him. Was Judas aware of the very place that Jesus was accustomed in gathering with his disciples to pray or whatever? Was he accustomed to that place? He knew exactly where they're going to be. He knew exactly. Remember, the religious leaders did not want to arrest Jesus in broad daylight in front of the public because they were afraid that there was going to be an uprising, an insurrection with the people because they loved Christ. Some of them, half of them, I don't know the percentage, but they understood that people would rise up. So they had to do it discreetly. They had to do it secretly. And so Judas said, hey, if you give me a certain amount of money, I know exactly where they're going to be tonight. I know exactly where they're going to be. And I'll do you even one better. I'll be the very one to lead you to them and make sure you get them. So notice, if you would, in verse 2. And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oftentimes resorted there with his disciples. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, whom seek you? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, whom seek you? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these disciples go their way, that it might be fulfilled which he spake, of them which thou gave me, I have lost none. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, put away thy sword into the sheath, and the cup which my Father has given me, shall I not drink it? Then the band and the captain and the officer of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. Whatever hurt someone might have caused you, it's not new. This kind of hurt is not new. Whatever betrayal you have suffered, betrayal is not new. If you have experienced betrayal, it has happened to many people and not just you. If you have experienced hurt, it's happened to many people and not just you. But once again, it's what are you going to do with that betrayal? What are you going to do with that hurt? What are you going to do with that pain that was inflicted upon you? Are you going to harbor that pain, harbor that betrayal, harbor that hurt, harbor that trauma, and just spend the rest of your life living in your past and crippling your future and hindering your relationship with God and with one another and just being miserable? Because you cannot have joy when you're living in your past. You cannot have joy. So I say to you, whatever hurt someone might have caused you, whatever betrayal you have suffered, for your own benefit, for your own sake, you need to let it go. My second point, why do you need to let it go? Why do you need to let it go? These experiences can build walls around you, or build walls around your heart, rather. And instead of enjoying meaningful relationships, you will constantly experience insecurities, anxieties, jealousy, pride, trust issues, anger, bitterness, difficulty in maintaining meaningful relationships, misery, inability to embrace the future with all its possibilities, and above all, your relationship with God will be hindered. People who have not overcome their past deal with constant insecurities, deal with constant anxieties, deal with constant envy because they're afraid they're going to lose something they love. They're very proudful. They have trust issues. They're angry. They're bitter. And they have a very difficult time in developing strong bonds with others. They have a casual relationship with others, but they have a hard time developing strong bonds in their relationship with others. And because of the anger and because of the bitterness and because of the distrust and because of the insecurities, people that are plagued with those things often unintentionally push others out of their lives. Notice in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 25. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 25. In Proverbs chapter 12, verse 25, it says, heaviness in the heart of man maketh it stoop, but a good word maketh it glad. Another translation says, anxiety in the heart of man causes depression. And once again, people that have experienced trauma, betrayal, rejection, they're constantly dealing with anxiety. They can't get their mind to rest. They have a hard time going to bed at night. They're always trying to distract themselves so they don't have to think about things in the past. And they're always trying to keep themselves busy all the time because they don't want to think about those things that they still hold on to. So in their mind, it's better not to think about it. Just stay busy, get wrapped up in all kinds of activities so I don't have to think about it. And they're always going to be dealing with anxiety, insecurities, trust issues, anger, bitterness. They're going to have a very difficult time in maintaining relationships. Go to Proverbs chapter 29, verse 22. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 22. In Proverbs chapter 29, verse 22, an angry man stirs up strife, and a furious man abounds in transgression. If we still hold on to anger because of what we have experienced from our past, that anger can easily go off at any time. And anger is not going to add any type of value to relationships. We're just going to stir up strife. You know, a lot of people at work, they're the ones that are stirring up division within the department. They're the ones stirring up strife because they're angry people. They go to work and they just stir things up. A lot of people are stirring things up in their home because they're angry people. Why? In this case, we're talking about because they're still holding on to the hurt and the anger of what was inflicted upon them in their past by people they trusted, by family, by a friend, or so forth. Notice in Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 2. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 2. In Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 2. It says, when pride comes, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. What does pride bring? Shame. You can tell that people become proud and they use it as a defense mechanism. They use pride as a defense mechanism. For instance, maybe somebody went through a bad relationship in their marriage, and maybe that spouse was unfaithful, that spouse left him or her, and then now they're trying to pick up the pieces. And then when the topic of marriage comes up, they say, well, I don't want to get married. Or marriage doesn't work. Or marriage is just a piece of paper. They develop a bad attitude about marriage. Why? Because they're still holding on to their past. They're still holding on to the past. We say things that we don't mean, but we say things out of pride because it's a defense mechanism. We don't want to really be vulnerable to allow ourselves to care again because we don't want to hurt again because we haven't overcome our past hurt and our past betrayal. Notice, if you would, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 15. So let me ask you a question. Like some of the things that we talked about, does anxiety help your relationships out? Does insecurities help your relationships out? What about trust issues? Does that help your relationships out? And because we might be insecure, we become envious because we're afraid any threat, we're afraid we're going to lose it. Does that help your relationships out? What about pride? Does pride help? In other words, you might enter into a relationship, and then in this relationship, maybe your spouse says something, and in your mind you become very proudful because you're like, I went through that already in my past, and I'm not going to let you do that to me again. And they were just like, had nothing to do with your past. But because you experience it, anything that might resemble what you have experienced, right away you're ready to just stand your ground and fight if you have to. Does that help your relationship, that kind of pride? And so we're the ones that are going to suffer. Now, you can go all your life and you can say, you know what, I'm going to ignore this, but you're going to go into your grave, and you're going to go into your grave with very shallow relationships. You're going to go into your grave with a past of misery. You are not able to enjoy each day that God blessed you with because your mind is always focusing on what happened to you. And your relationship with God is going to be hindered because anxiety doesn't help relationships, either with man or with God. Pride and anger does not help relationships, either with God or with our fellow man. And these things stem when we are still holding on to the past betrayal, holding on to the past rejection, holding on to what was done unto me. Notice in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. I want you to notice the language in this verse. It says, looking diligently. Do we need to be diligent and guard against any type of thoughts that might promote bitterness in our heart? We need to be diligent. We need to be on guard. We need to be watchful. When somebody says something to you that hurt you, that disrespected you, that was not nice, you need to be diligent and guard against that thought that will come into your heart and promote bitterness toward those people. It says, looking diligently, lest any man fail the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up. What does bitterness do? It springs up, and what does it do? It troubles. It troubles your household. It troubles your department at work. It troubles even the church. When two individuals in the church are at odds with one another and they're bitter at one another, it troubles the church. And it says in the latter part, and thereby many be defiled. So before you allow bitterness to take root, you better uproot it, remove it. I told you this before. At one time in my former home, there was some rose bushes, and I wanted to remove them because they were dying because their owner was not watering them. And so I went to one rose bush, and I just was able to just grab that rose bush and just pull it out of the ground, and went to the next rose bush, and I was able to grab that rose bush and pull it out of the ground. But there was a third one that I tried to pull out of the ground, and it was hard. The roots were solid. And I even got like an axe, shovel, a pick, and I did my best to try to like pick around it and just cut it up at the bottom, and it was still hard. Finally, we had to get like a chain and get some kind of machine to just pull that out of the ground. Why was it hard for us to get that out of the ground? Because roots have been established. And I'm telling you right now, there's people in the church that are going to suffer in their relationship with God and the relationship with the church because there's still roots of bitterness there. And we need to not allow that to happen to us. So we need to go to God, and that could be your stronghold. You know, that could be your stronghold where these bitterness, these bitter thoughts continue to plague your life. If you want to grieve, if you want to go to your grave with anger, if you want to go to your grave with bitterness, if you want to go to your grave with insecurities, if you want to go to your grave with envy, if you want to go to your grave with trust issues, if you want to go to your grave with misery, if you want to go to your grave with regrets, if you want to go to your grave with guilt, if you want to go to the grave with squandered time, if you want to go to your grave with broken relationships and anxieties, then keep holding on to the past. But if you want to experience joy, meaningful relationships, and a bright future with God, then you need to learn to let go. Now, my question is, how do we let go? And Lord willing, next Sunday morning, we'll talk about that, okay? Lord willing, next Sunday morning, we'll talk about how to let go. All right, I appreciate everybody being